Welcome to Under the Radar, a show about independent iOS app development. I'm Marco Arment.
And I'm David Smith. Under the Radar is never longer than 30 minutes, so let's get started.
Today we wanted to talk about a topic that is near and dear to me. It is coming late to things, being late bloomers to new technologies or new techniques or new abilities. Things like interface builder use, things like, view controller containment, basically things that I either didn't do early on or that I minimally used early on or just never even gave a shot. And that I later, more recently, have come to realize, oh, this is actually useful, or even maybe now it's useful. Maybe it wasn't that useful in 1.0, but maybe now it has become more useful over time as Apple has made these things better. This happens to me all the time. My default reaction to new technologies coming by is, I probably don't need that, because much of the time that's true. But that attitude makes it hard to find those times when that's not true, and it often makes me come late to things. Now, the benefit of coming late to things, any of the issues that 1.0 brought, those have probably been worked out. Or you will have heard from a bunch of people like this technology or this thing is not worth using. But the ones that are worth using, by the time you come late to them, yeah, you've missed some time of potential improvements and efficiencies and everything. But when you get there, it's really awesome and easy to use, and the tools are better, and everything's more stable. It isn't all bad being a conservative curmudgeon like I am about new technologies. Are you that way at all?
Yeah, so I'm a very strange person in terms of I have these two different mindsets when it comes to new technology. So at WWDC, Apple announces here's the whole new set of stuff that is now available for Apple developers, and I get really excited and look into and very often start using totally new technologies, things that weren't possible before that are now possible. And I'll be one of the first people in the world to run down that and try and use it and see where all it's in. Often it's, kind of half broken and the beta period's really tricky, but I like that part of the development cycle and enjoy it. But whenever Apple introduces something that is a replacement or extension to something existing, and so this is a pattern that I've seen Apple do many times. I started developing on iPhone OS 2.2, I think was the first OS version that I was building against.
Wow.
Which is way back in the day. And you see what it took to build something then. And now so much of the stuff that we would write custom frameworks for or have to do ourselves is now just built into the system. And there are all these things that a problem that we had to solve manually or directly before. And then Apple comes along and says, enough people are doing this that we should probably create a system method for doing this that'll be more stable and almost certainly more, better resilient against iOS changes, because, when iOS 9 goes to iOS 10, Apple's going to make sure that, collection view still works correctly. Whereas if I've had my own custom collection view class, suddenly I'm the one who has to go in and make all the changes to make sure that it works nicely on the new OS. And so Apple is rightfully so extending and expanding the universe of things that we can do. But I always struggle with the feeling of, if I have an existing solution for something that kind of works and that I'm familiar with, it's a really hard sell to kind of tear down everything that I built and then replace it with Apple's thing. And especially, like you said, early on, because in that early phase is when there's the most bugs. And then you can have the really bad feeling of regret, where it's oh, I should just go back to doing it the way that I used to do it, because I knew where all the problems were. If there was a bug, I could fix it. And that was a mindset that's a very easy trap to get into. But on the flip side, I definitely look at some of these things and I wonder if I'm missing out. And history maybe has shown that in some ways I'm missing out, in some ways I'm not. Obviously the best thing is when you see a technology fly by, you don't embrace it, and then it ends up dying. Like iCloud Core Data Sync, for example, as a technology that when it came out, I was like, ooh, that is interesting. I use Core Data and I sync data to a server. I wonder if this would be cool. And I kind of poked around a little bit, but never really went down that road because I had an existing infrastructure.
Good.
Turns out that was a great situation, right? I think that was, officially killed this last summer. And if I'd gone all in on that, I would have been in a world of hurt. But on the flip side, if I had seen CloudKit when it came out and went in on that, that's a technology that seems to be ascendant, that seems to be on its way up. And so at this point, there's part of me that's like, maybe I should be using that. Maybe that would be a wise thing for me to be using. And having the benefit of time makes that choice a lot easier, I think. And so there is certainly a benefit to, if a technology is being replaced or improved upon, that I think you can be more conservative. That if it's something totally new, then just go for it and try it. And, if it doesn't work, well, what have you lost? But being a bit more conservative when it's something that is just an extension, for me anyway, feels like the right approach.
It helps to, as you mentioned, like catching things when they're ascendant. That really helps with keeping up with Apple, basically keeping up with the new devices that launch, new OS capabilities. Apple makes it easy on you if you kind of follow their guidelines. If you kind of like take like the tracks they lay out for you, like they pave out a way that they want you to do things. Whether it's the language choice, in this case, now it's Swift. Whether it's things like using Interface Builder, using storyboards, using adaptive layouts, like all these things. Like Apple makes things easy to do things their way, and then generally speaking, if you do things their way, you will have less friction, or things will be easier for you in the near future as they introduce new technologies, new devices, things like that. And you don't have to do things their way. But if you don't, you're generally signing yourself up for more work. Like for me, one of the biggest things about that was when they brought an adaptive layout for the iPad. Like that that changed a lot of things for a lot of people, because like if you had, first of all, if you had like a separate iPad app and an iPhone app, that broke everything. Because all of a sudden, like, well, now your iPad app kind of has a reason to have the entire iPhone app with it so that it can run in skinny mode on the sidebar. And if you were doing things in a basic way with like a typical UI split view controller, things like that, like then things were easier for you. But if you were away from the Apple way, you had more work to do.
Yeah, and I think too, it's an interesting point about how Apple tends to strongly sort of telegraph where they're going.
Yeah.
With their announcements, that this is a pattern that we've seen many times, where Apple introduces they solve a problem, or they make something easier that either that falls sometimes when it's, I remember when they first changed the size of the iPhone, like that was the year that we got auto layout, if I remember right.
Yep.
And like they do those kinds of moves where they can, because obviously they know what their roadmap is for the next 6 months, for the next year, for the next 2 years, and they can look forward to what that's going to be, and start preparing the ground for what's going to make development on that platform the best now. And so there's definitely a wisdom in looking at what are these new technologies and extensions that they're adding to the frameworks, that what is, like, start asking yourself, well, what could this mean? Like they start adding the size classes, and I always remember there was in the first size class WWDC session where there's like, they have the quadrant of like the compact and wide. And so they have like, this one is this, these devices fall in this category. These devices fall in this category. These devices fall in this category. And this category, we don't actually have any devices that fall into that category yet. And obviously, like superficially, you could say like, that's just the way it fell out. It's like, no, Apple is actually telling us that. I think in that case it was I
believe it was the 6 Plus in landscape, which has, I believe it has the normal, which is like iPad size horizontal class, and then the compact vertical class.
Yeah, exactly. Like those types of things, like Apple is telling you something there. And so being aware of it, even if you're not going to adopt the new technology, it's probably a good thing to be kind of suspicious when they start changing things, to see like, what could this mean down the road? Because they're not going to waste their time just adding stuff for no reason.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things for me so to get into some specific examples here, one of the things for me in this area was view controller containment, or having child view controllers, basically, and implementing your own parent view controllers. And, for I think for most iOS developers, you've seen, kind of view controller bloat disease. It is so easy to have tons of code in view controllers, because that's kind of just where everything falls. And I know there's different models. There's like MVVM and stuff. I haven't really gotten into any of those yet, so I can't really speak to them. But every iOS developer has seen the massive view controller syndrome. And one of the things that helps that a lot is by making child view controllers. So like, like in Overcast, I'll have like different panels and everything. And rather than having like on the now playing screen, there's like the effects panel. Rather than having that be part of the now playing view controller, that is its own view controller that can be presented or stuck in various places. Just using the stock stuff, using things like popovers and split views and navigation, of course, all these things, page view controllers, using all those things can get you very, very far. But one of the biggest things I've done recently, I started making my own parent view controllers also now. One of the things I did was I have replaced UI split view controller with my own custom version of something that does fairly similar things, but does them kind of more my way. Because when I was looking at Overcast code, I have spent so much time, and there was so much like hacky, weird like configuration and exception code, things like like intercepting trait collection changes and weird things like that, all to get UI split view controller to do what I wanted. The amount of code I have to just bend this existing component to my will is so much and so fragile and so hacky. I can actually make my own split view equivalent controller that just does things the way I want it to, with actually far less code, like by a mile. Because the built-in components, they have all these limitations in place that Apple thinks they should be designed this way, but one of the reasons it's necessary is because like they have all these different options in how you can configure them. They have to work in all these different ways. They can't make as many assumptions as you can. They can't rule out certain options that you won't use. So like in their implementations, they're never going to accommodate everything, but at the same time, they have to be like so complex to accommodate all the things they do manage to encompass. When you make one for yourself, you can do anything you want and only what you want. And that's incredibly powerful. And, writing everything yourself is not always the best solution. That's not always a good use of time. But in cases like this, like I've been fighting with UI split view controller and various like adaptive layout things for over a year now, and it's just like this. I don't need to do this. Like, why am I doing this when I can just write my own? And so I took one day. I'm like, let me see if I can write my own in one day. And sure enough, of course, it was easier than I ever imagined, because the view controller containment stuff is very mature now. It's been around for a while. I think since iOS like 5 or 6. It's kind of old, right?
6, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's been around for a while. So all this stuff was very, very easy to do. I also made a custom UI page view controller. It basically didn't. I wanted to do some custom gesture and view handling that it just was not capable of doing without tons of hacks. So I just made my own. And the one I made is not as good as theirs for general purpose use, but for my use, it's way better, and it really is not that much code. And it's more of like basically removing times where you have to really hack with UIKit. Because UIKit's so complex, there's so much there that it has to do, and so much of my time designing interfaces in the past has been fighting UIKit to just try to customize something the way I want it. And over time, that's become easier, but there's still places where you have to do it, especially like around new technologies like adaptive UI and stuff like that, when those things kind of come out. And so to get yourself out of the business of hacking UIKit is so freeing and so good for your overall code health and technical debt. I highly recommend it. And one of the biggest ways to do that is view controller, basically using view controllers properly and not trying to hack the existing ones if they don't fit your needs.
Yeah, but I think what you're speaking there is such this strange tension that when you are looking at these new technologies, because the base building blocks in iOS are overall, I would say, really, really good. Like the number of things that you can build with just a scroll view is immense. Like, I mean, one of my favorite talks at WWDC, I don't know if they did one this last year, but previously it had always been the, like, what's new in UI scroll view. Mm-hmm. And they would build these really sophisticated interactions that were just a scroll view at the end of the day. And it's that strange tension where if you use a page controller, like it's like you can get that first thing working really quickly, but you very quick, you'll start to run out of runway. And it's a question, I suppose, of how much control you want to have and how much you want to be responsible for all the weird edge cases, all the strange issues that are going to happen, I suppose, either way. If you use UI page controller, like there's going to be some issues that you just can't work around, and you're just like, oh well, like it just doesn't work the way I like it to in this particular situation. So then you're like, okay, let me just build my own. And now, of course, you're like, the important thing I think maybe is to say is when you do that, it's good to be sort of cognizant and keep your eyes open for what you're taking on when you do that. Because Apple's engineering teams are they're no slouches. Like, they are really good at what they're doing, and it takes a lot of engineering work to build the UI page controller, for example. Like, that's not just a simple thing they threw together in a day. And so if you're going to replace it, you probably need to be aware that it's going to be a lot more work than you think, and there's going to be weird edges and problems that you're going to have to run into. Like, I remember this with Activity++, where it has this kind of custom animation where it starts off with the rings, and if you tap it, like, the rings unfurl and turn into the bar graph, which is this kind of cool animation that I thought of, and I was like, oh, I really want to build this. And I started to see if I could build this with UI view animation, because I would far prefer to do it with some kind of built-in mechanism. And in the end, I couldn't, because it was just too complicated of a thing to get performant and to get to look right. And so I ended up just building it myself using like raw core graphics that I do the animation of each frame of that animation and draw it, I'm just essentially just drawing that to a bitmap and displaying it each frame, which is great. It looks just how I want it, but it means there's all kinds of weird issues and performance problems and compatibility things between different platforms that if I was just using UI view animation, just wouldn't happen. And so for me, the trade-off was worth it. Like, I couldn't do it the other way, but I kind of wish that I was able to do it the other way. And I think that's something when I think of these new technologies that Apple puts out, like, there's this, I definitely always have that tugging sense of, oh man, I wish I could just use whatever it is. I wish I could just use auto layout. I wish I could just use size classes. But then as soon as I hit that edge, I have such this tension of just saying like, oh, well, just throw my hands up and walk away, which is perhaps a bit childish.
Well, but you have to always be defensive of your time. Like when you're trying out something new, or when you're thinking about rewriting a system component for your own use, like, it is very easy to fall into a time hole here and just burn tons of time doing something that actually isn't productive. Part of the judgment of when to do that and when not to just comes with doing it wrong for a number of years and eventually gaining that wisdom. And part of it is kind of just luck. A lot of times you can't really tell what's going to be a good use of your time up front, but that's the risk you take with new stuff. All right, our sponsor this week is Braintree. Go to braintreepayments.com/radar. By next year, maybe even next week, there could be a whole new way to pay for things. Maybe it will be the next Bitcoin or the next Apple Pay, or maybe even both. Fortunately, Braintree's full-stack payment platform is easily adaptable to whatever the future holds, so you can adapt easily too if you use Braintree in your apps. You can accept everything from pounds to PayPal to whatever the next big innovation is from any device with just one integration. And when that new payment method comes out, all you have to do is update a few lines of code. No late nights, no complicated recoding, no stress about staying ahead of the curve. Braintree is here to help. You can find out more at braintreepayments.com/radar. That's braintreepayments.com/radar. Thank you very much to Braintree for sponsoring our show.
One other thing that I was thinking about with this topic, though, is it's something that you run into if you are behind the times. Like, I'm very often behind the way, like Apple has this new technology, this new approach that they're recommending, and I'm late in adopting it. The thing that I always notice too is that you'll start to run into that can be really annoying is suddenly all the documentation, all the example code, all the things that you see on Stack Overflow, suddenly don't work for you anymore. Like, you have to not only have you built your own approach, like, even if it's not like you're just going down the road of like doing something custom, like if you just have old code, then suddenly you have this new thing that Apple has put out, they're pushing, and that's where all their focus is going. Suddenly that's where all the documentation is written for, and the example code they publish will use that new thing. And so there's not a lot of great examples, and it becomes harder and harder. And like, the biggest example is probably Swift. Like, I remember there was this transition period where all of a sudden all the answers on Stack Overflow for questions I had about the new technologies were all the example code was just written in Swift, or in people's little like snippets. And that can become really awkward, and is probably a good reason to try and adopt some of these things with some urgency, just to not be sort of fall behind to a degree that you just can't work out what to do, or perhaps moreover, you're wasting time. Like, I remember sitting there wasting time, like trying to translate the Swift code into Objective-C, and then trying to work out how to then take that concept and apply it into my own app. but I have to do this like level of indirection. Whereas if my app was in Swift, I could like, oh, I see what they're doing there. I can build it, for myself now. And that's something that I think it takes a lot of experience to realize, that you're not just running into technical issues, you're running into like educational and learning issues as well.
Oh, yeah. But, that's just kind of par for the course. As things move on and new things come in, that's kind of like part of the cost of sticking with old stuff is that everyone else moves on, it seems. And that isn't actually, it isn't everyone. That's how it seems like when you're searching for help or documentation or looking for where Apple's attention is going. Like once the new thing comes out, all those people move on to it. And if you are lagging behind or you're sticking with the old thing, that's just, again, it's just part of the cost of doing business,
Oh, sure. But it's a weird feeling when you're like, in some ways, I love that I have some, I have apps on the App Store that have existed for years, and obviously this is, it's a very classic issue in software engineering of dealing with legacy code, that you have things that work, that you'll go back to, and I mean it's a crazy feeling when you go back and look at code and run blame in Git, and you see code was written back in 2009 or 2010, and you're like, what was I doing? Like, why did I have this strange exception? And so often you run into this situation where like you were coding around an iOS bug in iOS 5 that you no longer need to code around. And at some point, like you have this weird cycle where you're coding around a bug that then gets resolved. And then your fix starts to actually be the bug and cause the problem, because you're doing stuff that is sort of counter to what the modern approach is.
And that's probably why it's so hard to be a UI kit engineer.
Yeah. No, I definitely don't envy envy that team where they do this really cool, amazing work, but like the number of, like having it work across all the different devices and all the different things, and having an iOS, because another thing that's kind of crazy is the way they approach with binary compatibility. And like, you can still run an iOS 4 app on iOS 10. Like it'll probably be a little bit broken and janky, but like they do a lot of work to keep things forward, which is perhaps another, like I was saying earlier, but another reason why being like, I keep telling myself to be less of a curmudgeon about the new stuff, because I'm probably wasting a lot of time that, Apple is paying engineers to do this work. And then I'm just like walking past them and saying, nope, I'll do it myself. I'll take care of this myself, where that's probably an inefficient use of my time.
Yeah. All right, so let me give a few examples of some of the more recent things that I've been working with in the last few weeks doing Overcast 3.0. In the last few versions, I've made extensive use of KVO, key value observing, and this has been helped tremendously by the FB KVO controller. It is a fantastic open source component. I highly recommend that anybody using KVO or curious about KVO do it with the FB KVO controller. Don't do the raw calls, because they're full of bug potential, and the Facebook one avoids a lot of that and is very nice to use. Generally, this is in very short terms a way to have some code notified whenever a certain value of a different object changes. So this is kind of, and I think this is what Reactive Cocoa is all about. Mostly, it's like basically, and please forgive me if that's wrong, but basically like kind of having views and controls basically update themselves based on values that change, and also similar to what OS 10 did with bindings, which never made it to iOS. But honestly, having used them very briefly, I think they're kind of cool. I know there's potential issues, but they can be pretty cool. Where I've been moving basically is moving, rather than having like a view controller that has a stock UI switch, and having the view controller manage the state of that UI switch and be notified when the switch is toggled to go change a value, to assign it the value when it's loaded or when the value changes. Moving all of that into a custom subclass of UI switch or whatever the control is, and having the control manage itself. And that takes tons of code out of the view controllers and makes way more reusable components, way easier. If you're into testing, it's way easier to test these things also. And it really eliminates tons of potential weirdness and bugs and edge cases. Like one of the screens that I just made uses a table view that has a couple of switches and buttons in it. In the old way of me doing these things, I'd either not monitor for underlying changes, like if a change gets synced over, that would change one of those switches or buttons, or I'd monitor from the view controller, and if any of those values change, I just call table view reload data and just reload the entire table. And that sucks. Like if you can avoid doing that, you should. And I don't need to reload a whole table to change the value of one switch that where like the underlying data happen to change during that view's presence on screen. I can just subclass that switch and just have like, rather than having like, a whole bunch of plain UI switches in a table view, the one that has the rotation setting, that's now an OC rotation switch. And now I can, in my table view, when I'm making the cell, I can just say accessory view equals OC rotation switch. And the switch itself, in its code, it watches the value, it adds itself as a target, and has its own target implementation of like, I'm going to change this value now, and it's basically making these components self-contained. And where this really shines, not only cleaning up your view controllers and code reuse and testability and everything else, where this really is awesome is another bad word that I didn't use for a long time: interface builder. I recently started using interface builder to design some of my main screens, as well as I started using IB designable components.
Oh, nice.
And this is a thing where you can implement a couple of methods and put a couple annotations on your files. Just look up IB designable. You can basically make custom controls appear correctly in Interface Builder. So if you need to draw things custom on a button or style it in a certain way or whatever else, you can do all that and have that show up in Interface Builder rather than just having a big empty white view or like an unstyled button or something like that. Using that, basically, I'm trying to get as much code as possible out of view controllers because, again, that's kind of like a bad technical debt, bug potential kind of ridden area. So just try to make smaller view controllers, and a big thing with that is using Interface Builder as much as possible. And Interface Builder is not like a panacea, but if you do my approach of like having self-contained components that manage themselves, and if you take advantage of things like IB Designable, a lot of things become easier. For instance, portrait and landscape differences with auto layout. Oh, again, I'm also using auto layout now in Interface Builder. That had a
Shocking.
really, I know, yeah, that's like, I thought I'd never do that, but one day I just kind of plowed through. I'm like, I'm gonna learn how to do it, and then I can decide whether I really need to use it or not. And it turns out, yeah, it's not easy or intuitive, but neither is anything else about Interface Builder. And and once you figure out, you have to like right drag from itself to itself, like weird. all the little weird things you have to do to make Interface Builder work correctly, that are most of which are totally undiscoverable. Once you figure those out, auto layout in Interface Builder really isn't that bad. It's not easy, but it actually can be more productive in some cases, depending on what you're doing. And so, basic things like if you're going to have a difference between a portrait and landscape layout, it makes it so much easier to do that. In fact, my one wish for it is that I wish that the size classes were more granular, more like CSS. Like I would love to be able to say, if the width of this view is less than 300 points, then change this condition, rather than just being like, if this is horizontal or vertical compact. Like the size classes that we have now are very coarse, and I would like things to be more powerful, more like what CSS does with like media queries and stuff. But other than that, I have had fantastic luck in my recent redesign and cleanup of this code, basically using stuff that's new to me that is not new to anybody else in iOS development. I'm still not using storyboards, but
you're not going crazy.
No. I mean, that would be crazy. But I have found it really, like, these things make so many things easier. Like as I mentioned, like the self-contained buttons and things, that makes it easier to implement custom themes because I have all the controls that have a themable property. I have them monitor for appearance changes in my appearance manager class, and then they can just redraw themselves. It makes it easier to support dynamic text that way also, because I had a little trick in my app where my appearance did change notification. I just mapped it to the system's text category size did change notification. So basically all my handling, like if either you switch into or out of dark mode in Overcast, or if you go and change system font size, it does the same thing. So all my labels can redraw themselves, everything can resize itself. I can do this without this kind of technique and without these kind of technologies. I for many years I have, but it just makes it so much easier and more reliable to do it this way, and it makes the code a lot more manageable. And it does make it easier to take advantage of new technologies that Apple introduces going forward. And so that's I think where most of the value is here. So, I guess maybe I'll probably have to try Swift pretty soon, but maybe I don't go crazy there either. We'll see.
Not yet. Just one step at a time.
Yeah.
Slowly walk down this road.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, we're out of time this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.